I moved to northern Wisconsin when I was 29, mostly because I wanted space. I had spent most of my adult life living in apartments, sharing walls with people I didn't know, listening to arguments that weren't mine, and footsteps at all hours of the night. By the time I found the listing for a small, single-story house just outside a town I'd barely heard of, the idea of isolation felt comforting instead of scary. The house sat on a long stretch of snow-covered land, surrounded by pine trees and open fields. The nearest neighbor was far enough away that I couldn't see their house unless I drove down the road. At night, there were no streetlights, no traffic noise, no background hum of civilization, just wind and sometimes coyotes. Winter up there was a different kind of quiet. People who don't live in places like that think snow makes everything peaceful. What it really does is erase things. Sound travels strangely, distances feel wrong, and when storms roll in, you start to understand how small your world actually is. This happened in mid-January, during a blizzard that the local weather stations didn't fully anticipate. They warned about heavy snowfall and strong winds, but nothing that suggested what actually came. By early evening, snow was coming down sideways. The wind was strong enough to shake the house, rattling the windows and making the old wooden beams groan in ways I wasn't used to yet. I remember checking my phone repeatedly, refreshing the weather app, watching the warnings escalate from advisories to alerts. At around 9 p.m., the power went out. The house fell into complete darkness, except for the faint glow of snow reflecting through the windows. I lit a few candles, more annoyed than scared at that point. Power outages weren't uncommon during storms like this, and I expected it to come back within a few hours. I sat on the couch with a blanket wrapped around me, listening to the wind howl outside. It was constant, not gusts that came and went, but a steady, roaring sound that made it feel like the house was sitting inside something moving. That's when I heard the knock. 3 knocks. Slow, evenly spaced, not loud. I froze. It took my brain a few seconds to process what I'd heard, because it didn't make sense. Nobody should have been out there. Visibility was almost zero, and the road leading to my house was already getting buried. Anyone driving in that storm would have been risking their life. The knocks came again. 3 more. Same rhythm. I stood up slowly and moved toward the front door, careful not to make any noise. My heart was beating harder now, not because I felt immediate danger, but because something about the knocking felt wrong. It wasn't urgent. If someone was lost in a blizzard, cold and scared, they would knock hard, pound on the door, yell, beg. This person wasn't doing any of that. I stopped a few feet from the door and called out, asking who it was. A man answered. His voice was calm, too calm. He didn't sound winded or cold. He spoke clearly, like we were having a conversation indoors. He said his car had slid off the road and that he needed to come inside to warm up. I asked him where his car was. There was a pause, long enough that I thought he hadn't heard me. Then he said, "Not far." That was it. No landmarks, no direction, just not far. I told him I would call the police and report the stranded vehicle so they could send help. I expected relief, maybe gratitude. Instead, there was silence. Then he knocked again. This time, the knocks were louder, more insistent. I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the cold. I told him again that help was on the way and that he should wait by his car. He didn't respond. I stepped away from the door and moved toward the living room window, trying to see outside. All I could make out was swirling snow illuminated by my porch light. No clear shape, no movement. Then I heard footsteps. They didn't crunch away from the house. They moved sideways, slowly, circling. I backed away from the window, every instinct telling me not to let him know where I was standing. The footsteps continued, steady and deliberate, crunching through the snow around the perimeter of my house. They stopped near my bedroom window. I held my breath. There was another knock, not on the front door, on the wall. 3 times. I grabbed my phone and tried calling 911, but the call wouldn't go through. Either the storm had knocked out service completely or the signal just wasn't strong enough. The footsteps resumed, moving away, then around again. He knocked on the back wall this time. Same rhythm, same calm. I locked myself in the bedroom, pushed my dresser against the door, and sat on the floor with my back against the bed, gripping a kitchen knife I'd grabbed on the way. I don't know how long it went on. Time felt stretched, distorted by fear and adrenaline. Sometimes the footsteps were close. Sometimes they faded, only to return minutes later. Occasionally, I heard him knock again, always 3 times, always unhurried. At one point, I thought I heard his voice outside my bedroom window, not shouting, just speaking softly, like he was trying not to wake someone. I didn't respond. Sometime after midnight, everything stopped. No footsteps, no knocking, just wind. I stayed where I was until morning. When the storm finally cleared, the world outside looked unreal. Snowbanks were piled high against the house, and the road was completely unrecognizable. It took hours before a snowplow came through. When police finally arrived, they searched the area. They found no stranded car, no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. Except for one thing. There were faint scuff marks in the snow directly beneath my bedroom window. Not footprints, just disturbed snow, like someone had stood there for a long time. The officer suggested maybe I'd imagined it. Stress, isolation, storms do strange things to people. I didn't argue, but I know what I heard. I still live in that house, and every winter when the snow starts falling hard enough to erase the road, I think about those knocks and how calm he sounded. A true winter blizzard horror story. I've been a tow truck driver in western Montana for nearly 12 years, and if there's one thing you learn fast, it's that winter doesn't forgive mistakes. People think snow just makes things inconvenient. Up here, it makes things disappear. Roads vanish, sounds get swallowed, and sometimes people do too. This happened during a blizzard that hit in late February, one of those storms that comes in fast and heavy. The forecast predicted snow, but nothing severe. By midnight, though, visibility was almost non-existent, and the wind was strong enough to rock my truck at stoplights. I was already out on a call when dispatch radioed in another one. A driver had called reporting their car stalled on a rural highway about 25 miles outside town. The call cut out mid-sentence, but the GPS ping stayed long enough for dispatch to get a rough location. Normally, in weather like that, police handle welfare checks first, but units were stretched thin, and I was the closest tow available. I remember hesitating before accepting the call. Something about the way dispatch described it didn't sit right with me. They mentioned the caller sounded calm, not panicked, not rushed, just calm. I headed out anyway. The drive was slow and tense. Snow came down so thick it blurred the edges of the road, and the wind shoved my truck sideways whenever I hit open stretches. I followed the GPS as best I could, relying on reflective posts to keep from drifting into the ditch. After nearly 40 minutes, I saw the hazard lights. They blinked faintly through the snow like a heartbeat struggling to stay steady. The car sat at an awkward angle on the shoulder, front end pointed slightly toward a shallow ditch. Snow had already piled up around the tires, and the hood was coated in a thick layer of white. I pulled in behind it and left my engine running. The first thing I noticed was how quiet everything felt when I stepped out of the truck. The wind was still howling, but it felt distant somehow, muted by the heavy snowfall. The kind of quiet that presses in on your ears. I walked up to the driver's side window and shined my flashlight inside. Empty. The keys were still in the ignition. The dashboard lights were off, and the interior felt cold when I opened the door. Not just stepped out cold, more like it had been sitting there for a while. I called out. My voice immediately swallowed by the storm. No answer. That's when I saw the footprints. They started at the driver's side door and moved away from the car, heading off the shoulder of the road. One set of footprints. At first, that didn't strike me as strange. People often wander off to look for help, especially if their phone dies or they panic. But as I followed them with my light, I realized something was off. The footprints were deep, but spaced too far apart. Not like someone trudging through snow, like someone walking easily. I followed them a few steps farther, then noticed something else. There should have been a second set. The car had a passenger seat. It was pushed back like someone had been sitting there recently, but there were no passenger footprints at all, just the single trail. The footprints led straight into an open field beside the road. No hesitation, no sign of slipping or stopping to reassess. I radioed dispatch and told them what I was seeing. They asked if I could follow the tracks a short distance to check for the driver, but warned me not to go far. I followed them maybe 30 yards into the field. That's when they stopped. Just ended. No disturbance, no drag marks, no circle where someone turned around. Just untouched snow. I stood there longer than I should have, scanning the darkness beyond my flashlight beam. The field stretched out flat and empty, disappearing into the white haze of the storm. I had the sudden, uncomfortable feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone was standing just beyond where I could see. I turned back toward my truck. By the time I reached it, the footprints I'd followed were already filling in, softened by falling snow. My own boots left fresh impressions that looked out of place, like proof I didn't belong there. Police arrived nearly 2 hours later after the storm eased enough for safer travel. By then, snowplows had partially cleared the road. In daylight, the scene felt different, less threatening, more ordinary. They inspected the car carefully. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no damage. The engine worked fine once they jump-started it. The gas tank was half full. The officers walked the area where I'd seen the footprints. They didn't find any. I pointed out where they should have been, describing the spacing, the direction. One officer nodded politely and said the wind probably erased them. Then he asked me a question that made my stomach drop. "Are you sure there was only one set?" I told him yes. He exchanged a look with the other officer and said they'd only found my footprints near the field. No missing person report ever came in. The car was registered to a man who lived 2 counties away. When police contacted him days later, he was confused. He said his car was parked safely in his driveway. Different license plate, same make and model. To this day, I don't take late-night calls during blizzards unless I absolutely have to. And every time I see a car on the side of the road during a storm, the first thing I look for isn't damage, it's footprints. A true winter blizzard horror story. I've spent most of my adult life hiking, and a good portion of that time has been in winter conditions. I don't say that to sound impressive, only to make it clear that what happened to me wasn't the result of carelessness or ignorance. I knew the risks. I respected the weather, and I followed the rules people always say will keep you safe. That's why this still bothers me as much as it does. This happened about 6 years ago in Colorado, in a mountain range I'd hiked dozens of times before. I knew the trails well enough that I didn't even need to look at the map for most of the route. It was one of my favorite winter hikes. Quiet, scenic, and usually empty once the snow set in. The forecast that morning called for light snowfall later in the day. Nothing serious. No blizzard warnings, no wind advisories. Just clouds moving in by afternoon. I packed accordingly. Thermal layers, extra food, water, emergency bivvy, headlamp, compass, GPS, and my phone fully charged. I wasn't reckless. I told a friend which trail I'd be on and when I planned to be back. I started the hike around 9 a.m. The trail was quiet, blanketed in fresh snow that muffled my footsteps. The air was cold but calm, the kind of stillness that makes winter hikes feel peaceful instead of threatening. I remember thinking how perfect the conditions were. No wind, good visibility, just a soft gray sky overhead. For the first 2 hours, everything went exactly as expected. Then the wind changed. It wasn't sudden at first, just a faint shift in direction, like the air had decided to move differently. The temperature dropped quickly, and the clouds overhead thickened, darkening faster than I'd seen them do before. Snow began falling harder. Still, nothing felt dangerous yet. I'd hiked through worse. I checked my GPS, confirmed my position, and kept moving, planning to turn back earlier than usual just to be safe. That's when visibility collapsed. One moment, I could see the trail ahead of me clearly. The next, it felt like someone had thrown a white curtain over the world. Snow whipped sideways, and the sky and ground blended together into a single, featureless blur. A whiteout. If you've never been in one, it's hard to explain how disorienting it is. There's no horizon, no depth, no reference points. Everything looks flat and endless, even when you know it isn't. I stopped moving immediately. Panic is what kills people in situations like that, not the cold. I stood still, turned slowly in place, and tried to pick out any familiar landmarks, trees, rocks, anything. I saw nothing. I checked my GPS again. It froze. I tried my phone. No signal. I crouched down to get out of the wind and waited, hoping the storm would pass as quickly as it had arrived. Minutes stretched longer than they should have. The snow didn't ease, the wind grew stronger. That's when I heard the voice. At first, I thought it was my imagination, wind playing tricks, the way it sometimes sounds like distant talking when it moves just right. But then the voice spoke again. Clear, close, a man's voice. He told me not to stay where I was. He said I needed to keep moving or I'd freeze. I jumped to my feet, spinning around, trying to locate him. The whiteout swallowed everything beyond a few feet. I couldn't see anyone. I asked where he was. There was a pause, and then he said calmly, "Just behind you." I turned around immediately. Nothing. No footprints, no silhouettes, no movement. My heart was pounding now, but the voice didn't sound threatening. It wasn't rushed or aggressive. It sounded steady, confident, like someone who knew exactly where they were. He told me to walk forward slowly and keep my head down. I hesitated. Every safety instinct I had screamed that following a voice you couldn't see was a terrible idea. But staying still wasn't an option anymore either. The cold was already creeping into my fingers, and the wind was relentless. I asked how he knew the way out. He said he knew the trail better than I did. Something about that answer unsettled me, but I followed his instructions anyway. I took slow, careful steps in the direction he told me to go. Every few seconds he'd correct me, telling me to angle left, then right, warning me about uneven ground before I felt it under my boots. He never raised his voice, never sounded strained, and no matter how hard I listened, I could never hear his footsteps. At one point, I stopped again, overwhelmed by the feeling that something wasn't right. I told him I couldn't see him and asked him to come closer. He told me not to turn around. That was when real fear set in. I asked why. He said, "Because you won't like what you see." I don't know why I didn't run then. Maybe I was too cold, too tired, or maybe part of me already knew running blindly would only make things worse. So I kept walking. Minutes blurred together, the snow never let up, but somehow the ground beneath my feet began to feel more solid, packed, familiar. Then suddenly, the wind died down. Not gradually, instantly. The snow eased, visibility improved, and shapes began to emerge from the white. Trees, a signpost, and then just ahead of me, the parking lot. I stepped on asphalt and nearly collapsed from relief. I turned around, expecting to finally see the man who had guided me. There was no one there. No footprints leading up behind me, just my own tracks emerging from the trees. The storm continued to fade, and within 10 minutes, the sky looked almost calm, like nothing unusual had happened at all. I waited. I called out. No answer. Eventually, I made it back to my car and drove down the mountain in silence, replaying everything in my head, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Later that week, I reported the incident to a park ranger. I didn't mention the voice first, just the sudden storm and how quickly it had rolled in. The ranger listened carefully. Then he asked which trail I was on. When I told him, his expression changed slightly. He asked if I'd heard anyone talking to me during the whiteout. I felt my stomach drop. I asked him why he'd ask that. He told me there had been multiple reports over the years from hikers who'd gotten caught in sudden storms on that trail, people who claimed they'd been guided out by a calm male voice when no one else was around. Then he told me the rest. Years earlier, a hiker died during a winter whiteout on that same trail. Before contact was lost, the man stayed on the radio with rescuers, calmly describing the terrain, giving directions, and helping guide other lost hikers to safety. They never found his body. The ranger said it like it was just another strange fact about the mountains. I haven't hiked alone in winter since. And sometimes, when the weather turns suddenly and the wind shifts just right, I think about that voice. Still calm, still guiding, still somewhere out there, waiting for the next person who gets lost.